We're back here on our program, Jones and Company, and speaking with Mr. Alfred Sears today, the PLP candidate for Fort Charlotte. Mr. Sears, these are difficult economic times in the country, and the supporters of the current government would say, well, they've done their best under the current circumstances, given the pandemic, given what took place with Hurricane Dorian, that they've done well under the current economic crisis the world has experienced. What is your response to that?
Well, first of all, Mr. Jones, there is no question that we are living in a time that we've never seen since World War II. This is a period of tremendous crisis. In 3 days, September 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 2019, we lost almost a fifth of our GDP in those 3 days, $3.4 billion of damage. And that's based on the IDB's assessment. What it does not take into account was the psychic harm that the Bahamian community and visitors suffered who went through that ordeal of seeing loved ones wash out to sea, dying in the front of you, bodies you have to step over for days in the sun. That psychic harm, how do we measure the cost of that? Then, as we are trying to recover, we have a global pandemic where we would have lost, again, it hasn't been fully calculated because we're still in it, but certainly it would be roughly about $4 billion. So 1/2 of the GDP, which was just $10.8 billion, has been lost. On top of that, within this period, we have the debt has moved up to over $10 billion. Mm-hmm. We have an unprecedented deficit. I sympathize with the government. I would sympathize with any government under these conditions. The difference, though, between this present government and the team that currently assembled within the Progressive Liberal Party is that there is a lack of capacity demonstrated by the government. What do I mean by a lack of capacity? It's that in the worst of times, Mr. Jones, this is where leadership, vision, imagination, and courage can make the difference between disaster and triumph. Because in the worst of times, you can make decisions that ought to have been made 20 years ago. For example, how can you borrow and up to $6 billion and not put any of that money into building a new hospital and health infrastructure, knowing that a hurricane season is right upon us? How can you make decisions which are not in line with the scientific data as we did last July when the emergency orders were lifted and Bahamians allowed to travel and shop and so on? We have not recovered from, because it was after July of 2020 that you saw the spike. And we've never recovered from that. In other words, Mr. Jones, evidence-based decision-making, hard choices about building and utilizing borrowed money, not just, some of it clearly you have to buy food, but you also have to use some of it, Mr. Jones, to build a hospital. Health is a fundamental right. It's not just because I can afford to go to Miami or somebody can afford to fly out or be evacuated out on a plane. How many of us can do that, Mr. Jones? So hard decisions were not made that would ensure sustainability, resilience, but yet we have the debt. Then the question, Mr. Jones, is this. We see the evidence of global warming. The United Nations has declared the Bahamas to be one of the most vulnerable, all island states, vulnerable victims of global warming. And yet, notwithstanding the Paris Accord laying the foundation, we are not calling for global justice, climate justice. We're not calling for, in other words, we should be the leading voice and advocate in the international community because we are contributing the least, but we are suffering the most. And it's projected that some of our islands within the next 20 years will be under water. But yet we are not demanding climate justice. We're not asking for reparatory justice with respect to slavery. And we're not really addressing this question of debt forgiveness. We're not looking, I mean, you know, I admire Barbados.
Why?
Because Barbados, in negotiating with the bond dealers, they have inserted in their bond agreements what they call a disaster clause. If there were to be a defined disaster under that clause, then the debt servicing is suspended. And they have a formula laid out. You mean to tell me, having experienced Dorian in Abaco and Grand Bahama, we do not have the intellectual capacity. We've gone out and we have gotten several bonds, several billions of dollars in bonds. Ought we not to have negotiated, as Barbados did, some relief in the event of another hurricane or other disaster? So what I'm seeing, Mr. Jones, is a lack of capacity.
Tell me, you say that, and there are people who observe what's happening in all of the political parties, the attentive public. They look at the slate of candidates in the Progressive Liberal Party, the FNM, and the others, and they wonder whether or not anything will change. What gives you the confidence that the level of competence in government will change, will be any better if your party is elected?
Well, Mr. Jones, the difference here is a combination of what I call three clear advantages. One is that we are based on a philosophical foundation that was articulated from 1953. That is sustainable development. Arthur Hanna called it based on Bahamianization. It is also strong commitment to social justice, that is not to be serving the privileged few. And what you will see, first of all, in the economic plan that the Progressive Liberal Party has put out 4 months ago, it says recover, and it laid out some immediate things that the party will do. It talks about, with respect to the pandemic, free testing. This isn't no time to create niche economic opportunities. Free testing. Why should someone who makes $200, $300 a week as a condition for their employment, have to take a weekly test, taken from that $300 to pay for the tests in order to work in establishment. In this small population, we should have free testing. We also talk about eliminating the restrictions which are not based on a scientific data, as we did last July when we opened up the country, contrary to what the scientific data was. We talk about short term, and we also talk about medium and long term, and we recognize, Mr. Jones, that there needs to be revolutionary measures. We have to diversify this economy. We have to make a massive commitment to development of the orange economy. In other words, the Bahamian product, entertainment, the creative imagination, the creative industries, so that the people who come here are not locked down in a hotel as if they're in Las Vegas, but they could experience the Bahamian culture and the Bahamian creative imagination, the blue, the sea, developing the blue economy, developing the resources with Bahamian interests, and of course the value chain of tourism, improving the tourism product, and of course the agricultural.
You mentioned the philosophy of the Progressive Liberal Party framed way back in '53, and some of the things that the Progressive Liberal Party thought that it should be about, and some of those things were achieved. There are a good many people who would suggest to you that some of the philosophical positions of the PLP were adopted by the Free National Movement, and over the last 30 years, the Free National Movement ran the government longer than the Progressive Liberal Party. Because it is thought that there has been an erosion of PLP support, particularly in heartland communities of this country. What do you say?
Well, I think there's no question that some of the ideas which were associated with the Progressive Liberal Party have been articulated by the Free National Movement. But I think that it's easy to see that the predominant interest in the Free National Movement is the merchant elite of our country, in terms of controlling the agenda. And you know, the United States just put out a report about corruption and so on. And there's no mystery why, notwithstanding the Free National Movement's commitment to enact an integrity legislation, it has just been sitting in the office of the Attorney General, and I believe that it is because of the predominant economic interests which controls that party. So while you have a lot of the rhetoric, for example, the over-the-hill initiative, we see that it does not receive the sustained commitment and investment. And this is the difference that not only are we committed to the philosophy, but we have the we have the capacity to implement the social programs as well as the economic diversification program. And when you look at the Progressive Liberal Party and the team assembled, you see it's not just a group of lawyers. It's a very diverse group of persons who are bringing a range of competencies that they have developed in the private sector, as unionists, as teachers, and business people running various sizes of enterprises. And they're bringing this composite of competencies, and we are committed, Mr. Jones, to the philosophy. It's not a matter, it's not a political tactic to gain support grassroots support or this sector support. It is something that is at the very core of the organization, and the competence is there, and the leadership is there.
Mr. Sears, do you believe that the Bahamian people, they vote on the basis of issues, or they vote on the basis of emotionalism and on partisan politics? Because we are polarized, and there are some people who are, no matter what the PLP does, will remain PLP. And conversely, no matter what the FNM does, whether the FNM is incompetent or not incompetent, whether it's corrupt or not corrupt, they are going to remain FNM. Isn't that right?
No. Mr. Jones, increasingly the pool of electorates who are implacably committed to the Progressive Liberal Party and to the FNM, for example, is diminishing.
You really think so?
I think so. I think that increasingly more persons, because the country is primarily young people.
You think the PLP would ever win St. Anne's, for instance?
It's possible.
You don't think that the people...
It is possible because St. Anne's changes. It changes by boundary. It changes because of, it depends on the configuration.
But you've never won it over the last 50 years.
Yes.
Or more.
Okay. But there are other constituencies that the FNM has not won. Well, the South Andres, I think, has been, there was once, yes, there was one term.
As a matter of fact, the current Prime Minister said that in the last election that he could have won all the seats. And as a matter of fact, he intimated in recent times that he believes that the FNM can win all.
Well, the current Prime Minister has made a number of predictions. But the point is, back to your original question. I think that the Bahamian public, a greater percentage, are looking at the performance of any government, irrespective of the party. And if there's a level of disillusionment, there tends to be a shift, and almost like a herd shift to the other party.
You call it groundswell support.
Yes, it becomes a little more difficult now because you have other groups that are gaining traction with respect to the natural resources of our country and so on. So I think that the Bahamian people, they're looking for policies in which they can see a future for their children. And increasingly, I think that we have to recognize, and this is the conversation that we're having within the Progressive Liberal Party as the platform is being formulated, is we must provide that hope, that concrete roadmap based on the National Development Plan that had been developed by Mr. Christie under his administration. And we need to reinstate a long-term strategy, which hopefully there could be a wide cross-section of consensus so that we are not making these shifts, because the government of the Bahamas is continuous. But the government is not PLP owned or FNM owned. It's the aggregation, it's the collective will of the Bahamian people.
I hear you, Mr. Sears.
And there should be a long-term strategy to achieve sustainable and resilient development. And that can only come about with a national development plan. And that is what the Progressive Liberal Party, with a very developed focus on the natural resources, the establishment of a sovereign wealth fund that can give strategic focus and build the capacity to achieve the long-term goals of the development plan. So this really offers us an opportunity to reset.
You say that we should reset, or it offers that opportunity. I had an interview with the former Prime Minister, Mr. Christie, in the last few days, and what he said to me, he expressed his disappointment that the electorate so gullible, he didn't say gullible, my word, in accepting certain things, propaganda, like they stole the VAT money. He said that they did not understand the impact of his government's work with Bahama, didn't really appreciate what they were seeking to do with regulating gaming in the country, and he berated the FNM for raising value-added tax and pursuing his gaming policy with respect to web shops. I mention all of these things because I believe, he surmised that the electorate were not really listening to the issues, weren't dealing with the issues, and voted his government out for some unknown reason. Some people say it's because of Christie. What do you say?
No, Mr. Jones, I have a different point of view. The Bahamian people are much more discerning than that point of view give them credit for.
Okay.
Perhaps it was that Mr. Christie did not publicize and inform the public of all of the magnificent things that his administration during that term were doing, right? And therefore, it's the same thing now that we see. Let me draw an analogy. The Prime Minister is a doctor. So he's supposed to have a scientific background and education. He should be engaged in public education himself as well as his government to counter all of this conspiracy theories that are populating social media and have Bahamians feeling so ambivalent about whether to take the vaccine. If I were in his position, I would be at the forefront, debunking these conspiracy theory and putting the scientific justification, putting the national imperative, and giving people a more balanced point of view. You see, it's easy to say.
Is that
it's
for
easy
him to
to
do, or for
no,
the technicians, the technical people
Well,
to do?
the point is this: leadership. Let me tell you something. However you look at it, if you're a leader, just like Mayor Motley, she goes, of course she has epidemiologists and a director of public health and so on, but as the leader, is the head of government, and the people put a certain premium and trust in what you say, everybody in the government has a responsibility to advocate, explain, and justify the public policy that they sit around the table and decide. And the fact that that is not being done effectively, perhaps we can say that Mr. Christie, when he was Prime Minister, there ought to have been a better public relations and public education of all of the wonderful things the government was doing. I do not take this view of looking down on the people and saying that the people are ignorant and the people are misinformed. I think that, it's like Plato and the allegory.
Mr. Christie's position was that the opposition was dishonest in dealing with the issues.
Well, the opposition
and misled the Bahamian people.
Well, the thing is this. The opposition will say certain things which are opportunistic. I mean, that comes oftentimes in a democratic society. But the point that I am making is that we have a responsibility. For example, I am on your show, and I've said unequivocally, I encourage every single Bahamian, in consultation with your doctor about any medical condition, get vaccinated. Because to my understanding, based on the medical knowledge of this moment, which is evolving daily, is that if you get vaccinated, the chance and degree of the effect of an infection would be less if you were not vaccinated. It does not stop the transmission. It relates to the degree of harm. I do not want to see any Bahamian who is infected. I had the virus last September. I had no symptoms, but people close to me had symptoms. I don't want any Bahamian, I don't want one, to have gotten infected and have to be intubated or worse. And to the knowledge that exists today is that this is the best measure. Secondly, we know as we are also managing the economic reboot of the Bahamian economy, that building an environment that is as safe as it can possibly be will facilitate economic recovery. It will enable Bahamians to travel more freely and easily to attend to our business. So when one looks at the public policy, when one looks at the health policy, and when one looks at the scientific data as it now, the responsible thing for me to do is to say to anyone who is listening to me, you know, based on your medical consultation with your doctor, get vaccinated. Absolutely.
Mr. Sears, as we, this is a very quick question, a quick response as we wind up the program. If your party would win the next general election, what would the reason be that you won?
When the Progressive Liberal Party wins, I believe it will be due to the fact that we have put forward an economic plan and we have put forward a national development plan based on the national development plan that had been developed with the additional commitments that we will make. Secondly, that the people who are presenting have the credibility, and people, that is the Bahamian citizenry, have confidence that we have the commitment to do what we promise. And I believe, having interacted with my colleagues, that we have the capacity to make the hard choices, to be diligent in making policy and effectively carrying out those policies, not to serve ourselves, but to serve the country.
Alfred Sears, thank you so very much for being here today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for watching and listening to our program. Good evening, everyone.